Hello there, my name's Brandon and I make pictures out of tiny squares. And in the case for today, those tiny squares are going to be painted on a 3D model because I'm back here for another project in Blockbench. What I'm making today is a low poly character model of Barbie in rollerblade attire. Specifically, it's the one that's from the Barbie movie because this outfit is just too rad to ignore. So I thought it'd be fun to see this one in this style and also just get a bit more practice with building and posing characters in this program. Now, if you haven't seen before, this program, Blockbench, this is a totally free to use modeling software, and its main association appears to be for use in creating custom content for Minecraft. But there's also a whole set of other default shapes that you can use in creating models. And once you start dragging around their vertices and inserting new cuts and angles and things like that, you can really get as complex as you'd like to here. You can then wrap the whole model in a pixel grid and you're able to paint pixel art textures onto the surfaces. And that's really the thing that caught my interest to first check this out. The reason that I'm using Blockbench for this and not something like Blender is really just because I appreciated that it felt ready to go out of the box like this for creating these low poly pixelated types of models. And certainly if people have pointed out, you know, it seems like there are ways to achieve this same functionality in Blender, perhaps through plugins or other means. Though for me, I found Blockbench just a little more straightforward to comprehend on first use. So it felt easier to hit the ground running here, but I would like to give Blender a serious go at some point as well. Anyway, what's going on here is that I'm starting by making the head, because I generally find that's the easiest way to then size out the rest of the character, especially when doing something that is going to have cartoony sort of proportions to it. Something I do always find a bit tricky though, both with 2D and 3D art, is definitely hairstyles. And in the case of Barbie here, this style has some hair down, some up in a kind of high pony or something. And then there's also a visor in there too. So the way I started was from that head with the visor, which without any other kind of detail to it, just sort of looks like someone wearing a hat maybe. But what I'm doing from here is just pinning this ponytail onto it. And then when it comes time to color everything, we can make that distinction between the hair and the visor. To have some hair coming down, I wanted to find a way to build off the existing structure rather than just sticking some new shape onto the side. So I selected some of the faces along the back there, and then I used the extrude function to pop out a new set of faces from those. And then by dragging all those vertices down, that actually created this pretty nice way to get that length of hair there. The final thing for the head was that I've created the ears from a 5-sided cylinder, and the hoop earrings are a 6-sided tube. And those are both default shapes that you can just drop in, and I've used those pretty much without any real modification done to them aside from a bit of resizing. When starting on the body, I was thinking about how this model is going to pose. So I've split the body into an upper and lower half. That way I'd have the option to rotate it at the waist or have it be able to lean forward or backward or whatever. Come to think of it, that's probably already more articulation than an actual Barbie doll would have. But I was mostly planning ahead for whatever like rollerblade sort of poses might be required here, right? In order to also accommodate a more natural spot for the legs to be attached, I reshaped the lower portion of the body to pretty much follow the shape of the leotard. And then the rest of the hips and leg can start directly from that spot. And I figured this natural separation of those pieces according to the costume will also help when it comes time to paint this up, since that can easily just be assigned color according to that bit of clothing. Going along with the idea of articulation, for things like the legs and the arms that need to bend at knees and elbows and stuff like that, I'm creating these as a series of cubes. So Blockbench isn't able to just take a long rectangular prism and basically bend it like a pool noodle, at least as far as I'm aware. I am still actually early in my use of this program. But one of the ways that you can create movable joints is basically to have everything split up into separate objects that can then rotate around each other. This works really well for this particular Barbie outfit since she is wearing knee pads and elbow pads, so that kind of helps in obscuring how funny it might look just to have the arms broken up into 3 or 4 smaller pieces. But I'll have to eventually try a character that doesn't have pads just to see how it alters the design philosophy maybe. Which is kind of funny because actually the other character that I did make in Blockbench was Solid Snake, and he also had knee pads and elbow pads. Perhaps just one of the many things that Snake and Rollerblade Barbie, of course, have in common. Now, when you've got an entire limb made from separate objects like this, you want an easy way to move the whole thing as a single unit, rather than having to reposition each piece one at a time. So what you can do is click on each of the objects that make it up. So in my case, there are 4 cubes that make up this arm. So I'll click on each of those while holding Shift to highlight each of them. And then right click and select Group Elements. You can see now that places them into a folder called Bone by default, since that's kind of like one solid piece now when using the folder. And when we drag it around, it now moves everything together. So this works really well just for repositioning things all at once. And you can rotate it also, which is what I'm doing here, just to fit it nicely against the body and everything else there. Now it's time for the fun part of coloring it up and actually bringing this character to life. So I'll select everything with Control A and then create a new texture. I tend to leave mine at the default settings. The only thing that I'm going to change here is to actually have the default texture set to a dark gray. I just find that a little easier just to see where I've painted and where I haven't. And then find our way over to the Paint tab, and we'll see that pixel grid all over the model, which indicates exactly how that pixel art is being mapped onto it. For the most part, this does a pretty fair job, but there are ways to adjust it, which I'll show in just a moment. For now, I'm just going to get started by just doing a simple pass over the whole surface and using the paint bucket to drop solid colors into every face of the model. This is just sort of a base coat, and then we can come back around later and add detail after this. So for this, I was comparing against the reference images, but then trying to select colors that were kind of just singular cartoony versions of the outfit, you know, as bright and colorful as it already is, of course. In the reference, the exact neon shades for the rollerblades and pads was a bit tough to pin down. I think they skew much more yellow than the sort of green tone that I initially settled on, but I do like the color complement with the rest. After the first set of flat colors, I did a second lap over the model using a darker shade of each as a sort of cartoony cell shading type of appearance. You can enable a shading light when looking at models, and that'll kind of cast shadows on it and stuff. But I've actually come to prefer leaving this off and just shading the model myself, since you can really make it look quite punchy with some darker colors in the right spots. And you can see already, just with a handful of tones like this, we're already getting a good bit of the way on the costuming and starting to see some nice dimension in the model too. Alright, for the actual detailing, I'm going to start with the rad pattern on the clothing. And for this, I started by looking at the reference image and tried to just generally get the same splashes of color in the equivalent spots on the model. But this particular artwork area is only about 16 by 20 pixels in size, so it's not a lot of room to necessarily capture all that same nuance of pattern without starting to look a bit messy. In particular, the white speckling felt like it added just a bit too much visual noise for my liking, even though it's still obviously adhering to the allowable resolution here. So what I did instead was to go back through and simplify a lot of these strokes into just these simpler, clearer lines, and then dotted in a few spots that do have speckles to them. So it kind of ended up being this loose adaptation of the original, but I feel like it's just enough pattern and color to get that same point across without being too noisy or overpowering. After that, I replicated this pattern idea onto the visor and then continued on with the remaining details across the model, which often use those same shade colors just to dot in details or kind of manual blending, like how I'm separating the hair and the visor here. For the face, I'm enabling the mirror painting option along the x-axis, which is going to allow me to paint both sides of the face symmetrically at the same time. To make a cartoony eye, I like to start with a black rectangular shape, and then surround it with white, and then you can kind of play with some line work along the top as a sort of abstraction for an eyelid or an eyebrow. And it's often just a bit of a balancing act as far as the actual pixel work to find some conformation that doesn't look too flat or too angry, depending what you're going for in this case. For Barbie, I was just trying to land somewhere neutral and pleasant. And then the thing that also affects the expression is the mouth shape. And for that, I actually wanted it to make this sort of big smile. So it's sort of like that say cheese smile that you freeze into when you get your picture taken. So I was just playing around to find something like that. By the way, you may have noticed already that I've only given her one arm and one leg so far, kind of like a Barbie that's been played with a bit too much. But the reason for this is just because these are going to be symmetrical pieces. So I'm going to paint up one of each first and then duplicate and mirror them. And they'll end up with the exact same texture assigned to them, which saves me from having to do it twice and ends up being more efficient for the texture page. So it's kind of a win-win all around. Sometimes when painting these models, you'll see spots where the pixel art doesn't wrap cleanly around the entire object. Like here on the leg, we can see the pink doesn't meet up corner to corner around the leg. And I think this happened because this piece does have a few angles in it and also a slight taper built into it. So that complexity just yielded this misalignment in the pixel grid. When you've got your model selected, you can see the texture artwork for the entire model up in the top left there, which represents this sort of unwrapped view of the artwork. And if we click on that particular part of the leg, it'll pinpoint where on this crazy map of artwork that exact texture assignment is found. So from here, you can zoom in and kind of click on and move any of those corners of that assignment and adjust the position of it. So I did this and got that first side lined up nicely, but then I turned the corner and I find myself having to kind of chase it around every other side to pin it down. But eventually I did find an alignment for this. And in this case, it wasn't actually too bad because I just needed to make these two solid colors meet each other. But I could see where if you had a more detailed piece, it might be a little tougher to make those adjustments. Alright, well this is nearly finished, and aside from missing an arm and a leg still, we should make sure all of the bones are rigged up to be able to easily pose the model. What I've done so far is just organize the shapes into broad categories of the head, body, arm, and leg. When you create groups like this, the default point of control comes in usually at the center of the assembly of these objects. Like for the arm group, we can see that the control point here is somewhere near the base of the elbow, which means if we've clicked on the arm folder and try to rotate it, it's going to spin around from that point. But what would be more useful is if it would rotate from up at the shoulder where it meets the body. To change this pivot point, we'll click on the pivot tool and then move that little set of control axes up to whatever we'd like to think of as being the shoulder here. So you can see I've got it exactly where that close edge of the arm actually meets up with the body. Now when we use the rotate function again, we can see that it's a more appropriate hinge for being able to pose the arm for this model. Now, we of course want to be able to access more movement than just pivoting a straight arm around everywhere. We also want to be able to bend the elbows and the hand, so the next step is to consider this sort of hierarchy for the rest of the arm. What I'm doing now is grouping the lower pieces of the arm together into a subfolder, and that'll allow us to control just those three pieces of the elbow, the lower arm, and the hand as one unit now. Following this, we can group the bottom two pieces for another point of articulation. And this is technically creating now a sort of double jointed elbow, but what it allows for is that we can create a more gradual angle change from one piece to the next. So each of the arm pieces are going to be at a certain angle with respect to one another, and then that elbow pad there is going to be kind of bridging the gap, so to speak, between those. Once again, it's actually sort of a bit of a blessing that she does have elbow pads, because I feel like that's sort of hiding the crimes of the arm pieces potentially clipping into one another. You can see actually what I do for this is I just have a bit of extra arms sticking into each subsequent piece. That way when you do start rotating them around, there's something that'll hide any weird gaps that may start to form. From what I've seen of character rigs in other programs, I think there's often some sort of skeleton underneath everything that would actually rotate or deform the character model to achieve this sort of movement. And for a while I thought I might have been missing something similar that would exist in Blockbench. But once I noticed that they call your folder groups bone by default, it kind of clicked with me that you're doing this sort of folder group and pivot point based sort of character rigging. And that works fine for me. As I said, I don't have much experience in this arena to begin with, but I could see how this might seem odd to see this sort of convention if you're familiar with another sort of working standard. The final thing then is to duplicate the arm and the leg and flip them over the x-axis, and those are just going to land in the exact equivalent spot. And I've got all the individual bone pieces ready to go, so I'm going to get this posed up and we'll take a look at the final model. Alright, well I gotta say, after I got a handle on the groups and the pivot points, it was actually a lot of fun to see how dynamic you could get with this sort of a fidelity of model. I've played around with a few more poses and expressions, and these ones are actually using the Pixelate option on the export at a value of 3, which I quite like the look of for this style of model. We'll go ahead then and close out now with some CRT time. So thank you for watching, and take care and keep it square.